The screaming started at Oro 347 Imperial Standard Time, just as it did every rotation in cell block RX-7. Kef Naral pressed his face against the cold, transparent steel of his containment unit and watched the guards drag another prisoner past his door. The man's legs had stopped working 3 days ago. Neural disruptor, most likely. The Empire had so many creative ways to break a person without actually killing them. Kef had been counting. 73 prisoners had been removed from his block in the past standard month. None had returned. The Imperial Correctional Facility on Kessel wasn't designed for rehabilitation. It was designed for suffering, measured in precise doses and administered with mechanical efficiency. Every aspect of the prison served a single purpose: to demonstrate what happened to those who opposed the new order. The facility stretched across the dead surface of Kessel like a massive wound, its dark spires reaching toward the poisoned sky. From the outside, it looked like any other Imperial installation: clean lines, imposing architecture, the kind of sterile functionality that the Empire favored for all its administrative buildings. But appearances were carefully maintained lies. Inside these walls, the true nature of Imperial justice made itself known through methods that would have horrified even the most corrupt senators of the old Republic. Kef's cell measured exactly 2 meters by 3 meters. He knew this because he had paced it 17,000 times since his arrival. The walls were bare metal, painted institutional gray, marked only by the scratches left by previous occupants. Some had tried to keep count of their days. Others had written names, family members, loved ones, people they would never see again. A few had simply carved random lines, the desperate scrawling of minds pushed beyond the edge of sanity. The lighting never changed. Harsh white illumination bathed everything in the same sterile glow, eliminating the natural cycle of day and night that helped human beings maintain their grip on reality. Sleep came when exhaustion finally overwhelmed the constant anxiety of imprisonment. Waking brought the immediate return of fear, the knowledge that each new day might bring fresh horrors designed by minds that had turned cruelty into a science. Food arrived through a slot in the door at irregular intervals, sometimes twice in what felt like a day, sometimes not for what might have been several days. The portions were calculated to maintain basic biological function while ensuring constant hunger. The taste was always the same: processed protein with a metallic aftertaste that lingered long after the meager meal was finished. Kef had learned not to think about what might be in the gray paste that served as the foundation of his diet. Water came from a spigot that functioned according to its own mysterious schedule. Sometimes it flowed freely, sometimes it produced only a thin trickle that required hours to fill a small cup. The uncertainty was intentional, designed to create anxiety about basic survival needs. Prisoners learned to hoard water in whatever containers they could improvise, knowing that the next opportunity might be days away. The uniforms were thin gray coveralls that provided minimal protection against the perpetual cold of the facility. No undergarments, no shoes, no personal possessions of any kind. The psychological impact was subtle but effective. The constant physical discomfort served as a reminder of powerlessness, of complete dependence on the mercy of captors who had no interest in showing any. Kef had been a pilot in the Rebel Alliance before his capture. A good one, according to his squadron leaders. He had flown missions against Imperial shipping lanes, conducted reconnaissance over occupied worlds, provided air support for ground operations that saved countless lives. His X-Wing had been his pride, his instrument for fighting back against the machine that ground entire civilizations beneath its treads. Now his greatest achievement was learning to sleep while standing up, pressed against the wall of his cell to conserve body heat. The arrest had come during a raid on an Imperial supply depot. Intelligence had indicated light security, minimal resistance expected. Instead, they had flown into a carefully prepared trap. ISB agents had been waiting, their information provided by someone within the Rebel command structure. Kef's entire squadron had been either killed or captured. their sacrifice buying the Empire nothing more than propaganda footage of destroyed rebel fighters. The interrogation had lasted for weeks. Imperial Security Bureau techniques were thorough, designed to extract every possible piece of information while leaving the subject alive for potential future use. They had wanted starfighter specifications, hyperspace routes, the locations of rebel bases, the identities of Alliance sympathizers. Kef had told them nothing, though the cost of his silence had been measured in pain that his mind still struggled to process. The medical droids that tended to prisoners between interrogation sessions were marvels of Imperial engineering. They could heal almost any injury, repair damage that would have been fatal under normal circumstances, restore a subject to functional condition for further questioning. But they were programmed with protocols that ensured the healing process was never quite complete, that some residual discomfort always remained as a reminder of consequences. Physical torture was only one component of the Imperial correctional system. Psychological methods were often more effective, requiring fewer resources while producing more lasting damage to the human spirit. Kef had been forced to watch recordings of Imperial victories, propaganda broadcasts that showed the destruction of rebel strongholds, the capture and execution of Alliance leaders. Some of the footage was real, some was manufactured. The uncertainty was part of the torment. Sleep deprivation was administered through random schedule disruptions. Guards would conduct cell inspections at arbitrary hours, their heavy boots echoing through the corridors as they moved from unit to unit. Sometimes they selected prisoners for additional questioning. Sometimes they simply made noise, ensuring that rest became impossible. The exhaustion accumulated over time, making clear thinking increasingly difficult. Isolation was perhaps the most devastating weapon in the Imperial arsenal. Kef had not spoken to another human being except his interrogators for over 3 standard months. The silence became a living thing, pressing against his eardrums until even the sound of his own heartbeat became unnaturally loud. He found himself talking to imaginary companions, carrying on conversations with people who existed only in his memory. The other prisoners in his block were invisible to him, sealed away in their own cells, suffering through their own carefully calibrated torments. Sometimes he heard crying, sometimes screaming, sometimes the wet sounds of someone being sick from fear or malnutrition. But he never saw faces, never learned names, never formed the human connections that might have provided some small comfort in the darkness. The guards were recruited from Imperial worlds where loyalty was absolute and questions were discouraged. They wore full armor at all times, their faces hidden behind standardized helmets that eliminated any trace of individual personality. To the prisoners, they were not people but functions, extensions of the Imperial machine that operated according to programming rather than human emotion. Some guards were more enthusiastic about their duties than others. These were the ones who volunteered for the special assignments, the enhanced interrogation sessions, the public punishments that served as object lessons for the rest of the prison population. They had been selected not just for their loyalty, but for their ability to inflict suffering without emotional involvement. They were artists of cruelty, their methods refined through practice and institutional support. The prison's administrative structure was a marvel of bureaucratic efficiency. Every aspect of prisoner treatment was documented, analyzed, and optimized according to metrics that measured the effectiveness of various correctional techniques. Some subjects responded better to physical coercion. Others broke more quickly under psychological pressure. The data was collected, processed, and used to refine methods that maximized compliance while minimizing resource expenditure. Dr. Valen Korak served as the facility's chief medical officer, though his understanding of medicine had been corrupted by years of Imperial service. He was responsible for ensuring that prisoners remained alive and functional throughout their incarceration, regardless of the methods used to extract information or maintain discipline. His reports to the facility commander were models of clinical detachment, describing human suffering in the same tone used for equipment maintenance schedules. The interrogation chambers were located in the lower levels of the facility, where the screaming couldn't disturb the administrative personnel. Each room was equipped with the latest Imperial technology, neural probes that could stimulate pain centers directly, drugs that loosened inhibitions while maintaining consciousness, sensory equipment that could detect the slightest physiological changes that might indicate deception. The interrogators themselves were specialists, trained at Imperial academies where the science of breaking human resistance was taught as a legitimate academic discipline. They understood anatomy, psychology, pharmacology, and dozens of other fields that could be applied to their dark work. They took pride in their efficiency, competing with colleagues to see who could extract information most quickly while leaving subjects intact for future use. Major Senna Thrace had been questioning Kef for the past month, her sessions following a pattern that had been refined through years of experience. She would begin with reasonable requests, simple questions about rebel activities that seemed harmless enough. When cooperation was not forthcoming, the pressure would gradually increase, each refusal met with escalating consequences that demonstrated the futility of resistance. The Major was not cruel in any personal sense. She took no pleasure in the pain she inflicted, felt no hatred for the prisoners she processed. Her methods were simply instruments, devices to be used with professional competence in service of Imperial security. The fact that her instruments happened to be human suffering was irrelevant to her calculations. She had a job to do and she was very good at it. Between interrogation sessions, prisoners were returned to their cells to contemplate what they had experienced and what awaited them. The time between sessions was carefully calculated to maximize anxiety while preventing the kind of mental collapse that would make further questioning impossible. Some prisoners tried to use this time to prepare themselves, to rehearse their resistance or plan their responses. Others simply endured, counting breaths or heartbeats to maintain some connection to the passage of time. The facility's security was provided by an entire battalion of Imperial troops, their presence ensuring that escape attempts were not just futile, but suicidal. Guard towers dotted the perimeter, their automated weapon systems programmed to fire on any unauthorized movement. The surrounding terrain offered no shelter, no cover, no possibility of survival for anyone who somehow managed to breach the walls. Inside the facility, surveillance was total. Every corridor, every cell, every common area was monitored by sensors that tracked movement, recorded conversations, analyzed behavior patterns for signs of potential rebellion. The prisoners existed in a state of constant observation, their every action cataloged and evaluated by systems that never slept and never forgot. Privacy became a memory, something that belonged to a previous life when choices had been possible and freedom was more than a theoretical concept. The constant knowledge of being watched created a psychological pressure that many prisoners found more difficult to bear than physical abuse. Even thoughts seemed to be under surveillance, monitored by devices that could detect stress patterns and emotional states through subtle physiological changes. The mess hall was the only location where prisoners from different blocks encountered each other, though conversation was prohibited and strictly enforced. The space could accommodate perhaps 300 individuals at a time, their movements controlled by guards who directed traffic with mechanical precision. Meals were consumed in silence, the only sounds being the clink of utensils against metal trays and the shuffle of feet as prisoners moved through the serving line. The food itself was nutritionally adequate but psychologically devastating. Every meal was identical, the same gray protein paste accompanied by processed vegetables that had been drained of color, flavor, and texture. The monotony was intentional, designed to eliminate one of the few pleasures that remained available to the incarcerated population. Even the most basic human need for variety had been weaponized against the prisoners. Kef had learned to eat slowly, to make each meal last as long as possible. The 20 minutes allocated for dining represented the only break in the routine of solitary confinement, even if communication was impossible. He could observe other prisoners, noting their condition, their level of despair, their proximity to complete psychological collapse. These observations provided no comfort, but they helped him gauge his own position on the spectrum of institutional destruction. Some prisoners had been in the facility for years, their faces bearing the unmistakable marks of prolonged incarceration. They moved with the shuffling gait of broken men, their eyes focused on nothing, their expressions vacant. They had learned the lesson that the Empire wanted to teach. Resistance was futile, rebellion was madness, survival depended on absolute submission to authority. Others were newer arrivals, still carrying traces of the defiance that had led to their capture. These prisoners sat straighter. Their eyes still held traces of anger. Their movements retained some echo of the pride they had once possessed, but Kef could see the process of deterioration beginning, the subtle signs that indicated the slow erosion of everything that made them human. The work details were another component of the Imperial Correctional System, designed to provide prisoners with just enough activity to prevent complete mental collapse while serving the practical needs of the facility. Some prisoners were assigned to kitchen duty, preparing the gray paste that fed their fellow inmates. Others maintained the facility's equipment, their technical skills exploited for Imperial benefit even as their spirits were systematically destroyed. The spice mines that had originally defined Kessel's economy continued to operate using prison labor, though the deadly conditions that had once killed thousands of workers had been modified to ensure a more sustainable workforce. Prisoners could survive for months or even years in the mines, their lives extended just long enough to maximize their economic value to the Empire. Mining shifts lasted 12 hours, conducted in the oppressive darkness of tunnels that stretched deep into Kessel's poisoned crust. The air was thick with particulates that slowly destroyed lung tissue, but medical droids ensured that the damage progressed at a manageable rate, keeping workers functional until their sentences were completed or their usefulness expired. The spice itself was valuable to the Empire, used in medical applications and sold on black markets to fund intelligence operations. Every gram extracted by prisoner labor represented profit that helped finance the expansion of Imperial control throughout the galaxy. The irony was not lost on the political prisoners who understood that their suffering directly supported the system they had tried to overthrow. Guards assigned to mine duty carried weapons designed for underground combat, their armor modified to function in the corrosive atmosphere of the deep tunnels. They monitored prisoner work gangs with the same mechanical efficiency displayed throughout the facility, their presence ensuring that productivity targets were met regardless of the human cost. Accidents were common in the mines, though most were not truly accidental. Prisoners who showed signs of planning escape attempts might find themselves assigned to particularly dangerous sections. Those who demonstrated leadership qualities among their fellow inmates often experienced equipment failures that resulted in cave-ins or exposure to toxic gases. The medical bay served as both a place of healing and a chamber of horrors, depending on the needs of the Imperial administrators. Prisoners injured during mining operations received treatment sufficient to return them to work, but chronic conditions were allowed to develop if they didn't interfere with productivity. Pain became a constant companion, managed rather than eliminated, serving as a reminder of the consequences of opposing Imperial authority. Dr. Korak's experiments were conducted under the guise of medical research, his subjects provided by the prison population that had no legal recourse or outside advocacy. He was particularly interested in the effects of prolonged stress on human physiology, documenting the various ways that psychological pressure manifested in physical symptoms. His research was valued by Imperial intelligence services, who could apply his findings to interrogation techniques throughout the galaxy. The doctor's methods were always documented as standard medical procedures, his reports carefully worded to obscure the true nature of his activities. Prisoners were described as volunteers, their consent assumed rather than obtained. Experimental procedures were classified as therapeutic interventions, their harmful effects dismissed as unfortunate side effects of necessary treatment. Some prisoners were selected for enhanced interrogation using techniques developed through Dr. Korak's research. These sessions took place in specialized chambers where medical equipment could monitor vital signs while various stimuli were applied to extract information. The subjects often survived these procedures, though they were rarely the same afterward. The psychological evaluations conducted by imperial psychiatrists were another form of torture disguised as medical treatment. Prisoners were subjected to batteries of tests designed to identify psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited during questioning. The results were used to customize interrogation techniques for maximum effectiveness, turning each individual's fears and anxieties into weapons against them. Mental conditioning was applied to prisoners who showed particular resistance to conventional interrogation methods. These procedures involved the use of drugs and sensory manipulation to alter thought patterns and emotional responses. The goal was not to extract information but to reshape the subject's personality, creating compliance through neurological modification rather than traditional coercion. The conditioning chambers were located in the facility's most secure section, their existence known only to a select group of administrators and medical personnel. Prisoners who entered these chambers often emerged as fundamentally different people, their rebellious impulses replaced by an overwhelming need to please their captors. They became model prisoners, eager to cooperate with any request, grateful for the smallest kindness shown by their guards. These transformed prisoners served as examples for the general population, demonstrations of what was possible when resistance finally ended. They moved through the facility with the mechanical efficiency of droids, their former personalities buried beneath layers of chemical and psychological conditioning. They had achieved the ultimate goal of imperial corrections, complete elimination of individual will in favor of absolute compliance. The religious services held in the facility's chapel were mandatory for all prisoners, regardless of their personal beliefs. The sermons delivered by imperial chaplains focused on themes of obedience, sacrifice, and the necessity of accepting one's place in the natural order. Rebellion was portrayed as a form of mental illness, a sickness that could be cured through proper treatment and spiritual guidance. The chaplains themselves were products of imperial theological academies, institutions that had transformed traditional religious teachings into instruments of state control. They spoke of the emperor as a divine figure whose will could not be questioned, whose authority derived from sources beyond human understanding. Resistance to imperial rule was therefore not just criminal but blasphemous, a violation of cosmic order that demanded correction. Prayer sessions were conducted with military precision, prisoners reciting approved texts that reinforced messages of submission and acceptance. Personal prayers were prohibited, spiritual needs addressed only through approved channels that ensured religious practice served state interests rather than individual comfort. Faith became another device of control, its traditional role as a source of hope and resistance carefully neutralized. The educational programs offered to prisoners focused on imperial history and ideology, presenting a version of galactic events that justified every aspect of imperial policy. The fall of the Republic was portrayed as an inevitable result of democratic weakness and corruption. The rise of the Empire was described as a necessary correction that brought order to chaos and prosperity to the galaxy. Prisoners were required to attend these classes, their comprehension tested through examinations that measured not just knowledge but ideological compliance. Those who demonstrated proper understanding of imperial principles might qualify for reduced sentences or assignment to less dangerous work details. Those who failed to show adequate progress faced additional conditioning or enhanced interrogation to correct their thinking. The library available to prisoners contained only approved texts, works of literature and philosophy that had been edited to remove any content that might inspire resistance or independent thought. Classic works were presented in versions that supported imperial ideology, their original messages modified through selective editing and commentary that recontextualized potentially dangerous ideas. Reading was presented as a privilege that could be revoked for infractions of facility rules. Prisoners who demonstrated proper behavior might be allowed access to additional materials, though all reading was monitored and subject to review. Books became rewards rather than rights, their distribution controlled to ensure that intellectual stimulation served the goals of the correctional system. The communication systems within the facility were designed to prevent any unauthorized contact between prisoners and the outside world. Mail was heavily censored, with most correspondence rejected for containing inappropriate content. Visitors were extremely rare, subject to extensive background investigations and limited to approved family members who had demonstrated loyalty to the Empire. The few letters that prisoners were allowed to receive had been edited to remove any content that might provide comfort or hope. News from the outside world was filtered to present only information that supported imperial narratives about the futility of resistance and the prosperity that loyal citizens enjoyed under the new order. Family communications were rewritten to emphasize the shame and suffering that criminal behavior had brought upon loved ones. The visiting rooms were equipped with surveillance equipment that recorded every word spoken during the brief encounters between prisoners and their families. These recordings were analyzed for intelligence value and used to identify potential security risks among the civilian population. Family members who showed signs of sympathy for the imprisoned often found themselves under investigation by imperial security services. The psychological impact of these monitored visits was often worse than complete isolation. Prisoners were forced to watch their loved ones struggle with the knowledge that any expression of support could result in their own arrest. The conversations became exercises in careful neutrality, emotional connections severed by the constant awareness of listening devices and watching eyes. Some prisoners received no visitors at all, their families either dead, arrested, or too frightened to maintain contact. These individuals existed in complete isolation from the outside world, their connection to their former lives gradually fading as memories became less reliable and hope became impossible to maintain. They represented the ultimate success of the imperial correctional system. Human beings transformed into empty shells that posed no threat to state security. The facility's location on Kessel served multiple purposes beyond simply housing prisoners. The planet's isolation made escape virtually impossible, while its hostile environment provided a natural deterrent to rescue attempts. The poisoned atmosphere and barren landscape created a sense of hopelessness that penetrated even the most determined spirits. The view from the prison windows showed only desolation, twisted rock formations carved by toxic winds, the skeletal remains of mining equipment abandoned when more profitable worlds were discovered, the occasional transport ship arriving to collect spice or deliver supplies. The landscape served as a constant reminder that there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no possibility of survival outside the prison walls. Weather on Kessel was another weapon in the Imperial arsenal. Toxic storms could last for days, their corrosive winds stripping exposed flesh from bone in minutes. The facility's environmental systems provided protection from these conditions, but only as long as prisoners remained compliant with facility rules. Those who caused problems might find their environmental suits malfunctioning during work details, their air filtration systems experiencing temporary failures. The night sky above Kessel was obscured by atmospheric distortion, the stars hidden behind layers of chemical haze that filtered out most natural light. Even the most basic human comfort of stargazing was denied to the imprisoned population. Their connection to the larger universe severed along with their freedom. Transportation to and from the facility was conducted with military precision. Prisoners moved in shielded transports that prevented any observation of the surrounding territory. The process itself became part of the punishment. Hours spent in cramped compartments with minimal life support, the discomfort serving as an introduction to the suffering that awaited at their destination. The staff quarters within the facility were designed to maintain the morale of Imperial personnel, while ensuring their isolation from outside influences that might compromise their loyalty. Guards and administrators lived in comfortable accommodations that contrasted sharply with prisoner conditions, the disparity serving to reinforce the consequences of choosing the wrong side in the galactic conflict. Recreation facilities for Imperial staff included fitness centers, dining halls that served quality food, entertainment systems that provided access to approved programming from across the galaxy. The contrast with prisoner conditions was intentional, designed to remind staff of the benefits of loyalty while demonstrating the consequences of rebellion. The staff's psychological support services were designed to help Imperial personnel cope with the emotional demands of their work. Counselors trained in Imperial ideology helped guards and interrogators process any qualms they might have about their duties, reframing cruelty as necessary service to the greater good and presenting prisoners as enemies who deserved their suffering. Training programs for new staff emphasized the subhuman nature of prisoners, particularly those convicted of rebellion against the Empire. These individuals were presented as traitors who had forfeited their rights to humane treatment through their criminal actions. The dehumanization was systematic and thorough, ensuring that staff could perform their duties without emotional interference. The facility's security systems represented the pinnacle of Imperial technology. Sensors that could detect the slightest unusual movement, force fields that could contain even force-sensitive prisoners, automated defenses that could respond to threats faster than any human guard. The prison was designed to be escape-proof, its multiple layers of security ensuring that even the most resourceful prisoners could never hope to achieve freedom. Emergency protocols existed for every conceivable situation, from prisoner uprisings to external attacks to natural disasters. These procedures had been tested and refined through simulations that accounted for every possible variable. The facility could continue operating even under the most extreme conditions, its mission too important to Imperial security to allow for any interruption. The command structure within the facility followed standard Imperial military organization, with clear chains of authority and responsibility that ensured efficient operation regardless of personnel changes. Officers were rotated regularly to prevent the development of sympathetic relationships with prisoners. Their tours of duty carefully managed to maintain optimal psychological distance from their charges. Warden Malthorn commanded the facility with the same methodical efficiency he had once applied to managing Imperial supply lines. His background in logistics served him well in the prison environment, where human beings were simply another resource to be managed according to established protocols. He took pride in his facility's reputation for security and efficiency, measurements that reflected his competence as an administrator. The warden's daily briefings covered all aspects of facility operation, from security status reports to prisoner health assessments, to productivity measurements from the mining operations. Every aspect of the prison's function was quantified and analyzed, its performance measured against standards that prioritized Imperial interests over humanitarian concerns. Disciplinary procedures within the facility were designed to maintain order through fear rather than respect. Punishments were public when possible, serving as object lessons for the general prisoner population. Minor infractions resulted in reduced food rations or additional work duties. Major violations brought physical punishment or assignment to enhanced interrogation. The solitary confinement units represented the facility's most extreme disciplinary measure. Isolation chambers where prisoners could be held for months without human contact. These cells were smaller than standard accommodations, completely dark, equipped with minimal life support systems that maintained biological function while maximizing psychological pressure. Prisoners who emerged from solitary confinement were often fundamentally changed by the experience, their personalities altered by prolonged isolation in ways that made them more compliant with facility rules. Some never recovered their capacity for normal human interaction, their minds permanently damaged by the extended sensory deprivation and social isolation. The execution chambers were used sparingly, reserved for prisoners whose crimes were deemed too serious for any possibility of rehabilitation, or whose continued existence posed a security risk to the facility. These deaths were carried out with clinical efficiency, documented for administrative purposes and reported to imperial authorities as routine corrections to the prisoner population. The facility's waste disposal systems handled both organic and mechanical refuse with equal efficiency. The remains of prisoners who died in custody processed through industrial recycling equipment that eliminated any trace of their former existence. Even in death, the imprisoned served imperial interests, their bodies converted into useful materials that supported ongoing facility operations. Record keeping within the facility was meticulous. Every aspect of prisoner processing documented in databases that could be accessed by authorized imperial personnel throughout the galaxy. These records served as models for other correctional facilities, examples of best practices that could be replicated wherever the Empire needed to manage populations of political prisoners. The psychological research conducted within the facility contributed to imperial understanding of human behavior under extreme stress, knowledge that was applied to interrogation techniques throughout the galaxy. The suffering of individual prisoners served a purpose beyond their personal punishment, advancing imperial science in ways that improved the efficiency of state control. Dr. Korak's publications in imperial medical journals carefully obscured the source of his data, while presenting his findings as breakthrough research in stress physiology and behavioral modification. His work was cited by other imperial scientists, contributing to a body of knowledge that helped refine techniques for managing occupied populations and extracting information from captured enemies. The facility served as a training ground for imperial interrogators and correctional personnel, providing hands-on experience in the management of political prisoners. New staff members could observe and practice techniques that were impossible to teach through simulation alone. Their education in the arts of human control enhanced by direct exposure to the results of various methods. The economic benefits of the facility extended beyond the spice mining operations, the prison serving as a source of valuable intelligence about rebel activities and sympathizers throughout the galaxy. Information extracted from prisoners helped Imperial security services identify and eliminate entire resistance networks, the suffering of individuals serving to protect the stability of the larger Imperial system. The facility's existence served as a deterrent to potential rebels throughout the sector, its reputation ensuring that many citizens chose compliance over resistance when faced with Imperial demands. The knowledge that capture meant not just death but prolonged suffering in places like Kessel helped maintain order on thousands of worlds where Imperial control might otherwise be challenged. The daily routine within the prison was calculated to break down individual identity while reinforcing dependence on Imperial authority. Prisoners were awakened at irregular hours, their sleep cycles disrupted to prevent adaptation to any predictable schedule. Meals arrived without warning, creating constant anxiety about when the next feeding might occur. Exercise periods were brief and conducted under heavy guard, prisoners allowed to walk in small circles within designated areas while armed troopers watched for any sign of communication or coordination between inmates. Physical fitness was maintained at minimal levels, enough to keep prisoners functional for work details but insufficient to support any attempt at resistance or escape. Hygiene facilities were shared and inadequate, designed to create additional stress and eliminate privacy. Prisoners were allowed to clean themselves according to schedules that provided barely enough time for basic sanitation. The lack of proper hygiene became another form of psychological pressure, undermining self-respect and human dignity through constant physical discomfort. Medical examinations were conducted regularly, though their purpose was surveillance rather than healthcare. Imperial physicians documented every aspect of prisoner health, tracking the effects of imprisonment on human physiology, while identifying individuals who might be suitable for experimental procedures or enhanced interrogation techniques. The dental care provided to prisoners was particularly cruel. Necessary treatment withheld until pain became unbearable, then administered without anesthesia as punishment for various infractions. Dental problems were allowed to develop and worsen, the constant pain serving as a reminder of imperial power over every aspect of prisoner existence. Vision and hearing tests were conducted to identify prisoners whose sensory capabilities might make them valuable for specific work assignments or interrogation procedures. Those with exceptional sight might be assigned to detailed manufacturing work. Those with acute hearing might be subjected to enhanced audio surveillance or used to monitor other prisoners for signs of escape planning. The pharmaceutical supplies available to Imperial medical staff included drugs designed specifically for prisoner management. Chemical compounds that could induce temporary paralysis, alter mood states, or cause specific types of physical discomfort without leaving permanent evidence. These substances were administered according to careful protocols that maximized their psychological impact. Sleep regulation drugs were particularly effective, chemicals that could prevent rest for days at a time or induce unconsciousness at inconvenient moments. Prisoners never knew when their next dose might arrive or what effects it might produce, creating constant anxiety about their mental and physical stability. Nutritional supplements were sometimes provided to prisoners, but these contained additives designed to create dependency and control behavior. Withdrawal from these supplements produced specific symptoms that could be used to coerce cooperation during interrogation sessions. The promise of continued access to necessary nutrients became another weapon in the Imperial arsenal. The clothing issued to prisoners was designed to be uncomfortable and humiliating. Sizes were deliberately incorrect, creating garments that were either too large or too small, interfering with movement and contributing to physical discomfort. Colors were chosen to be psychologically disturbing, shades that created subtle stress responses in human vision systems. Footwear was either absent or inadequate for the conditions prisoners faced during work assignments. Cold floors, rough surfaces, and toxic materials combined to create constant foot pain that made walking and standing increasingly difficult over time. This physical limitation became another barrier to any thoughts of escape or resistance. Personal items were completely prohibited, eliminating any connection to previous life or individual identity. Prisoners owned nothing except the inadequate clothing on their bodies, their existence reduced to pure biological function under Imperial control. Even basic comfort items like blankets or pillows were considered privileges that could be revoked for disciplinary purposes. The temperature within the facility was carefully controlled to create maximum discomfort without causing death from exposure. Cells were kept just cold enough to prevent comfortable rest, while work areas alternated between extremes that forced prisoners to adapt constantly to changing conditions that their inadequate clothing could not address. Air quality throughout the facility was another weapon in the Imperial system. Ventilation was adequate to prevent death from suffocation, but insufficient to eliminate the constant feeling of breathing stale, contaminated atmosphere. The air carried the smell of fear, sweat, and industrial chemicals that created a constant reminder of the hostile environment. Sound control was used to prevent rest and communication between prisoners. Background noise was maintained at levels that made conversation difficult while preventing sleep. Random loud sounds were introduced to create startled responses and maintain constant tension. Periods of complete silence were used to heighten anxiety and make prisoners more sensitive to sudden noises. The lighting systems throughout the facility were designed to prevent adaptation and create constant visual stress. Brightness levels fluctuated without warning, creating eye strain and headaches. The quality of light was harsh and unnatural, eliminating any connection to normal day and night cycles that might provide psychological comfort. Work assignments were rotated randomly to prevent prisoners from developing expertise or forming relationships with fellow workers. Just as someone began to master a task or find some satisfaction in competent performance, they would be reassigned to something completely different, maintaining constant frustration and preventing any sense of achievement. The educational programs forced on prisoners were designed to break down previous beliefs and replace them with imperial ideology. Classes were mandatory and conducted in uncomfortable conditions that made concentration difficult. Failure to demonstrate proper understanding of imperial principles resulted in punishment that included reduction of already inadequate food rations. Indoctrination sessions used sophisticated psychological techniques developed by imperial social scientists. Repetition, emotional manipulation, and reward systems were combined to modify thought patterns and behavior. Prisoners who showed progress in accepting imperial ideology might receive small privileges that made their existence slightly more bearable. The facility's library contained books that had been carefully selected and edited to support imperial goals. Classic literature was presented in versions that removed any content promoting individual freedom or resistance to authority. Technical manuals provided information that was useful for work assignments but carefully avoided any knowledge that might be helpful for escape attempts. Recreational activities were limited and strictly controlled, designed to provide just enough mental stimulation to prevent complete psychological collapse while ensuring that all entertainment supported imperial values. Card games were modified to include imperial propaganda. Physical activities were structured to reinforce hierarchical thinking and obedience to authority. The few entertainment programs available through the facility's communication systems were propaganda productions that presented imperial victories and rebel defeats in carefully crafted narratives. These programs were mandatory viewing for all prisoners, their reactions monitored and analyzed for signs of continuing loyalty to anti-imperial causes. Communication with the outside world was not just limited but actively used as a psychological weapon. Letters from family members were edited to emphasize the shame and suffering that criminal behavior had brought upon loved ones. Good news was removed while bad news was enhanced to create maximum emotional impact. The visiting policies ensured that any contact with family members became another form of torture. Visits were brief, heavily monitored, and conducted in conditions that made normal conversation impossible. Family members were required to submit to extensive security procedures that made visiting an ordeal for them as well as the prisoners. Transportation between different areas of the facility was conducted in ways that reinforced prisoner powerlessness. Shackles and restraints were used even for routine movements, creating constant physical discomfort while demonstrating imperial control over every aspect of prisoner existence. Guards used these movements as opportunities for additional harassment and intimidation. The classification system used to categorize prisoners created artificial divisions that prevented unity among the imprisoned population. Political prisoners were separated from common criminals, species were segregated from each other, and different levels of security clearance were assigned based on perceived threat levels rather than actual behavior. Status within the prisoner hierarchy was manipulated by imperial administrators to create competition and conflict among inmates. Small privileges were awarded to some prisoners and withheld from others, creating resentment and preventing the formation of cooperative relationships that might threaten facility security. The grievance procedures available to prisoners were designed to provide the illusion of justice, while ensuring that no meaningful relief was ever provided. Complaints could be filed through official channels, but the investigation process was lengthy, biased, and ultimately designed to validate imperial policies rather than address legitimate concerns. Legal representation was theoretically available but practically impossible to obtain. The few attorneys willing to represent political prisoners were either imperial agents or incompetents, whose efforts served to legitimize the judicial process without providing effective advocacy. Most prisoners faced their legal proceedings without any meaningful representation. The trial procedures used to process captured rebels were conducted according to imperial law, which had been carefully crafted to ensure conviction regardless of evidence or circumstances. The burden of proof rested entirely on defendants who were denied access to evidence, witnesses, or legal resources that might support their cases. Sentencing guidelines were structured to provide maximum flexibility for imperial judges who understood that their primary responsibility was supporting state security rather than administering justice. Sentences could be extended or modified based on prisoner behavior, cooperation with authorities, or changing political needs of the empire. Appeals processes existed on paper but were designed to delay and discourage rather than provide meaningful review of cases. The courts that heard appeals were staffed by imperial loyalists, who understood that reversing lower court decisions would be interpreted as criticism of imperial policy and career-ending disloyalty. The prison economy was carefully managed to prevent any accumulation of wealth or resources by prisoners, while extracting maximum value from their labor. Work performed by inmates was compensated at rates that covered only basic survival needs while generating substantial profits for imperial enterprises. Commissary services provided prisoners with access to basic items that were not included in standard facility allocations, but prices were set to ensure that most inmates could never afford more than minimal improvements to their living conditions. The small luxuries available through the commissary became powerful motivators for compliance with facility rules. Debt systems were used to control prisoner behavior, creating artificial financial obligations that could never be fully satisfied. Medical treatment, legal services, and even basic necessities were charged to prisoner accounts at rates that ensured permanent indebtedness and continued vulnerability to imperial demands. The currency system within the facility was completely controlled by imperial administrators, preventing any development of independent economic relationships among prisoners. All transactions were monitored and recorded, providing additional intelligence about prisoner relationships and potential security threats. Banking services for prisoner accounts were designed to prevent any accumulation of significant resources while extracting additional fees for basic financial transactions. Interest rates, service charges, and account maintenance fees ensured that prisoners remained dependent on imperial generosity for any improvement in their circumstances. Investment opportunities were non-existent for prisoners, eliminating any possibility of improving their financial position through personal effort or planning. The economic system within the facility was designed to reinforce powerlessness and dependence, while demonstrating the futility of individual initiative under imperial control. Insurance systems were used to create additional anxiety about health and safety while providing no meaningful protection against the risks faced by prisoners. Policies were expensive, provided minimal coverage, and contained exclusions that eliminated protection for most of the dangers actually encountered in prison life. Property rights for prisoners were non-existent, ensuring that any improvement in living conditions could be revoked without warning or compensation. Even the most basic personal items became privileges that could be withdrawn for disciplinary purposes, maintaining constant uncertainty about what minimal comforts might be available from day to day. Contract law within the facility was designed to benefit imperial interests while binding prisoners to agreements they could not fulfill. Work assignments, medical treatment, and educational programs were governed by contracts that gave prisoners no meaningful choices while creating legal obligations that could be used to justify additional punishment for non-compliance. Intellectual property produced by prisoners during their incarceration became the property of the Empire, ensuring that any creative or technical innovations developed behind bars could be exploited for imperial benefit without compensation to their creators. This policy eliminated any incentive for creative thinking while appropriating any valuable ideas that might emerge. Business regulations within the facility prohibited any prisoner enterprise while protecting imperial monopolies on all goods and services available to inmates. These regulations ensured that prisoners remained completely dependent on imperial systems while preventing any development of independent economic activity. Consumer protection laws did not apply to prisoners, eliminating any recourse when imperial services were inadequate or fraudulent. Prisoners could be charged for services that were never provided, sold defective goods with no possibility of return or refund, and subjected to deceptive practices with no legal remedy available. Employment law within the facility created obligations for prisoners while providing no corresponding rights or protections. Work assignments were mandatory, compensation was minimal, safety standards were non-existent, and working conditions were determined entirely by imperial convenience rather than human welfare considerations. Labor organizing was strictly prohibited, with any attempt to form unions or advocate for worker rights classified as seditious activity subject to enhanced punishment. This prohibition ensured that prisoners remained isolated and powerless while preventing any collective action that might improve working conditions or challenge imperial policies. Workplace safety regulations did not apply to prisoner work assignments, allowing imperial administrators to subject inmates to dangerous conditions that would be illegal in civilian workplaces. Injuries and deaths resulting from unsafe working conditions were classified as acceptable losses rather than preventable accidents requiring policy changes. Discrimination based on species, planet of origin, political beliefs, or previous associations was not just permitted but actively encouraged as a method of maintaining control over the prisoner population. Imperial policies deliberately created divisions among inmates while preventing any unity that might threaten facility security. Privacy rights were completely eliminated for prisoners, justifying unlimited surveillance and intrusion into every aspect of personal existence. This elimination of privacy served both security and psychological purposes, reinforcing powerlessness while gathering intelligence that could be used for further manipulation. Due process protections were suspended for prisoners, allowing imperial administrators to impose punishment without hearings, appeals, or other procedural safeguards that might limit their authority. This suspension of normal legal protections ensured that punishment could be swift, arbitrary, and unappealable. Freedom of speech, assembly, and religious practice were severely restricted for prisoners, with only imperial-approved expression permitted within the facility. These restrictions eliminated any outlet for dissent while forcing participation in imperial propaganda activities designed to modify thought patterns and behavior. The right to legal counsel was limited to imperial-approved attorneys whose primary loyalty was to the state rather than their clients. This limitation ensured that legal representation served imperial interests while providing the appearance of due process without its substance. Search and seizure protections were eliminated for prisoners, allowing Imperial guards to search persons, cells, and work areas without warrants, probable cause, or any other limitations. These unlimited search powers served both security and harassment purposes while reinforcing the complete powerlessness of the imprisoned population. Years passed in the grinding monotony of Imperial control, each day indistinguishable from the last except for minor variations in the specific torments applied to maintain psychological pressure. Kef's body adapted to the constant stress and inadequate nutrition, his muscles atrophying while his mind struggled to maintain some connection to the person he had once been. The interrogation sessions with Major Thrace continued at irregular intervals, her questions evolving as Imperial intelligence services gathered information from other sources about rebel activities throughout the galaxy. She pursued leads about Alliance safe houses, sympathizer networks, and operational security procedures with the patient persistence of a professional who understood that breaking human resistance was often a matter of time rather than technique. Kef's memories of life before imprisonment began to fade like photographs exposed to too much light. The faces of his fellow pilots became uncertain, their names slipping away despite his desperate attempts to hold on to them. The X-Wing he had flown with such pride became a vague recollection of metal and electronics rather than the extension of his will it had once been. Other prisoners came and went through the facility's vast bureaucracy of suffering, their faces glimpsed briefly in the mess hall before they disappeared into medical research programs, enhanced interrogation sessions, or simple death from the accumulated effects of prolonged incarceration. Some were transferred to other facilities throughout the Imperial prison system. Others were released after their spirits had been so completely broken that they posed no further threat to state security. The facility's reputation as a model of Imperial correctional efficiency attracted visitors from other prison systems throughout the galaxy. Warden Malthorn took pride in these inspections, his demonstrations of advanced interrogation techniques and behavioral modification programs, serving as education for administrators who would return to their own facilities with improved methods of managing political prisoners. Training programs for Imperial interrogators and correctional personnel used the facility as a practical laboratory, where theoretical knowledge could be tested against living subjects. New graduates from Imperial academies received hands-on experience in the application of psychological pressure, physical coercion, and chemical modification under the guidance of experienced professionals. Dr. Korak's research program expanded over the years, his experiments becoming more sophisticated as he refined his understanding of human psychology under extreme stress. His publications in Imperial medical journals carefully obscured the source of his data while contributing to a growing body of knowledge about behavioral modification that was applied throughout the Empire's educational and correctional systems. The economic returns from the facility continued to justify its existence in the eyes of Imperial accountants, who measured success in terms of spice production, intelligence gathered, and deterrent effects on potential rebels throughout the sector. The human cost of these returns was considered irrelevant to calculations that prioritized efficiency and effectiveness over humanitarian concerns. Intelligence gathered from prisoners at the facility contributed to the identification and elimination of rebel networks throughout the galaxy. Information extracted through months or years of patient interrogation helped Imperial security services anticipate Alliance operations, infiltrate resistance groups, and capture key personnel whose knowledge led to further intelligence gathering. The deterrent effect of the facility's reputation helped maintain Imperial control on thousands of worlds where the local population might otherwise have been tempted to support rebel activities. Knowledge that capture meant not just death but prolonged suffering in places like Kessel encouraged compliance with Imperial demands and discouraged acts of resistance that might have spread throughout occupied systems. Propaganda broadcasts featuring reformed prisoners who had learned to appreciate the benefits of Imperial rule, served to reinforce messages about the futility of resistance while demonstrating the Empire's capacity for mercy toward those who acknowledged their errors. These broadcasts were carefully produced to show former rebels expressing gratitude for the correctional programs that had helped them recognize their mistakes. The facility's security systems were regularly updated with the latest Imperial technology, ensuring that escape attempts remained impossible even as prisoner populations included individuals with advanced technical knowledge or force sensitivity. New detection methods, improved containment systems, and enhanced surveillance capabilities maintained the facility's reputation as escape-proof. Medical advances developed through research conducted at the facility were applied to other Imperial institutions, improving the efficiency of interrogation programs throughout the galaxy while advancing Imperial understanding of human physiology under stress. These advances contributed to the development of new drugs, surgical techniques, and psychological interventions that served Imperial interests. The facility's staff rotation policies ensured that knowledge gained through experience at the installation was spread throughout the Imperial correctional system. Officers who completed tours of duty at Kessel carried their expertise to other facilities, improving the overall effectiveness of Imperial prison management while preventing any single location from developing unique vulnerabilities. Emergency procedures developed and tested at the facility became standard protocols for other Imperial correctional institutions, ensuring that prisoner uprisings, external attacks, or natural disasters could be managed without interrupting the essential work of political rehabilitation and intelligence gathering. The command structure that governed the facility served as a model for other Imperial institutions, demonstrating how clear hierarchies and defined responsibilities could ensure efficient operation even under the most challenging circumstances. These organizational principles were applied to other aspects of Imperial administration throughout the galaxy. In his cell, Kef Naral continued to mark the passage of time through scratches carved into the metal wall. Though his ability to maintain accurate records had long since deteriorated under the constant pressure of Imperial methodology. The simple act of making these marks became his last connection to the agency he had once possessed as a free human being. The Empire had achieved its goals through patient application of methods refined over years of experience with populations of political prisoners. Another rebel pilot had been neutralized, his knowledge extracted through systematic pressure applied over months of careful interrogation. His example served to deter others who might consider similar choices in the ongoing conflict between Imperial order and rebel chaos. The machinery of Imperial justice continued its operation with mechanical efficiency, processing human lives according to established protocols that maximized the extraction of useful information while minimizing the resources required to maintain prisoner populations. Each individual processed through the system contributed to the larger goal of galactic stability under Imperial authority. The prison on Kessel stood as a monument to Imperial power and a demonstration of what happened to those who chose to oppose the natural order of galactic civilization. Its cells and chambers and corridors contained the broken remnants of beings who had once believed that individual freedom was worth fighting for, their transformation serving as proof that such beliefs were ultimately futile in the face of Imperial determination. And in the depths of that monument to power, former rebel pilot Kef Naral learned the final lesson that the Empire wanted to teach: that hope itself could become a weapon turned against those who dared to dream of freedom in a galaxy where only absolute submission offered any possibility of survival.